turn on. The session will be recorded. Please put all your questions for ARMS into this Slido that I'm going to pop into chat just now. We're going to take them from there. Again, as always, love hearing from you on Twitter, LinkedIn, the feedback, sharing the word. It's great to hear from you. And then after this session, we're going to have a 30-minute breakfast club led by Jax, who is a principal at Airtree. Definitely come along. It was a lot of fun yesterday and a great way to meet other people and see other faces on the screen versus just me and the speaker every day. So ARMS, so excited to have you on. You are the portfolio manager of Grok Ventures, and this is the private investment firm of Mike and Annie Cannon-Brookes, Mike being one of the co-founders of Atlassian. And before joining Family Office World, you spent over 7 years at JP Morgan in Equities Research. So we'd love to hear your story from early career through to literally one of the coolest jobs going. So I'm going to hand over to you, and then as we go, we'll sort of have questions through on Slido. So just everybody chuck them in there, and yeah, ARMS, hand over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Soph. Look, I might start from the very beginning, just because it's an unconventional starting point. So I grew up in Western Sydney in Housing Commission, which is subsidised housing from the government. It was very, it was a very tough upbringing. I'd like to liken it to the projects in the States. There were drug dealers. There was a drug dealer across the street from me. There were junkies up and down the road. Domestic violence was rife. I would literally fall asleep to the sounds of like screams and thwacks, which is awful. And it was just really tough. And, I tell people that, or start from there, to not to impress you, but to impress upon you that it doesn't matter what your starting point is. Like, you can get to wherever you want. It's always an unconventional way to get there, but it doesn't matter where you come from. So I always dreamed of a better life, obviously. I studied bloody hard. I got a scholarship to the University of New South Wales, which entailed working for 3 different investment banks at the time. And honestly, that was a godsend, because I'd say back then, but less so now, investment banking and the world of finance was more about who you know than what you know. And I had no connections. I had no private school connections growing up where I did. So it was a great way to get a foot in the door to get that scholarship. So I started at JP Morgan as a graduate. JP Morgan was a great foundation in a lot of things. I had 2 amazing didactic teachers there in my first 2 bosses, being Paul Brunker and Russell Gill. They taught me really simple but valuable things, like the fact that earnings for a company don't equal the cash flows, and cash is king. Cash is the most important thing you should look at a company. They were the first to drill that home for me. But as you'd expect in an investment bank, it was very process driven. It was very regimented. And they were set in their ways in a lot of aspects. Approvals were slow. A lot of the time that's needed to protect the bank, but also a lot of the time it's just red tape and processes were inefficient. And I kind of started to get a bit frustrated by that. It was also frustrating to be the only female in the room a lot of the time, and definitely the only. Actually, I didn't have pink hair back then, but I always had very radical hairstyles. So the only radically hairstyled person that was in a dress and not a pinstripe suit. So that was frustrating, and it's been my sort of lifelong mission to change that. I really want more young women to enter the world of finance and investments. I really do think that diversity of, opinion and thought creates just a better workplace, but also a better investment, because you bring just different knowledge to the table. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, then from there, I obviously met Mike. I met Mike through a contact that I made at JP Morgan. And I'll talk later about the value of kind of getting to know as many people as possible. Thomas Rice, so there's a little shout out for him. He introduced me to Mike Cannon-Brookes, and we're invested in Thomas's fund. He works at Perpetual. Mike it was just great to meet Mike, because it's very rare for you to meet someone and just know that you share values and you're so aligned with them straight away. And we had a great 3-hour chat, talking about everything from, the fact that we think insects are, could be one of the next protein sources, to, the fact that there does need to be more diversity in, workforces just generally. And yeah, we hit it off, and he was doing some extraordinary things, and I really wanted to be part of that. So yeah, it was, I guess, a little serendipitous, but I've been working with Mike and Grok for 3 years now, and it's been an amazing journey.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing that. I guess that leap from JP Morgan to then into family office world, did you know what that next step was for you? You talk about serendipity, but is it that you just wanted out of JP Morgan to do something else, or what was that thought process there?
Yeah, I think at JP Morgan, as I said, it was great in a lot of ways, but I did feel like another cog in the wheel there. And a lot of the time, I just thought, like, what am I actually contributing to society a little bit? When I was younger, I did a lot of advocating on behalf of young people. My mum has this great saying about she says it a lot. She says you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And in terms of like ambition and kind of leading me to water, my mum was the person to do that. And she always used to do that. When I was younger, I used to complain a lot about, honestly, how shit the world was and how bad our lot in life was. And one day she just kind of got fed up, and she was like, stop complaining. I've just found this advertisement in the paper saying, if you want to make a difference, come and join what was called the New South Wales Commission for Children and Young People's Reference Group, which was an advocacy organisation that aimed to advocate on behalf of young people to the New South Wales state government. So I ended up joining that committee at the time, and I did, a whole bunch of things along those lines, just kind of trying to improve young people's lot in Western Sydney generally. And I did a lot of that when I was younger. When I got to JP Morgan, I felt like I lost a lot of I was a very altruistic person, but I had lost a lot of doing things for the world. I used to say that improving capital allocation improves the world, but it was just a bit too distant for me. And so I kind of started looking for other things. I moved faster than I thought I was going to. Like, I had this stated aim of getting to be the #1 equities research team in small caps at JP Morgan. And I think we got to top 3, which was great, but obviously not one. And I was disappointed at not getting that. But one of the pieces of advice I'd say is definitely have goals, but don't be beholden to them, because you never know when opportunities are going to arise. And as I was starting to look for something else, I did get an opportunity at another family office. They reached out to me. This was the family office of a principal called Robert White, who had made his fortune through funds management and property development. And he actually owned a lot of the stocks that I was making buy and sell recommendations on at JP Morgan. So that's how he kind of knew me. And I interviewed with him, and I knew nothing about family offices, which is essentially the private investment firm of one family managing one family's money. And he introduced me to that. I learned from him that I learned a lot from him. He was an amazing investor. He delivered sort of, double-digit returns over a 10-year period every year. But what I really learned was you have to be aligned in values to the family that you're working with. And he just had slightly different aims, and there's no right or wrong, only outcome. He would invest in things like Aristocrat Leisure, which sells pokies to pubs, and that's not something that I was comfortable with. And I actually didn't know that I was uncomfortable with that until I did it. And I was like, actually, I want to try something else. And Mike, just through conversations with Mike, I realized how important impact and ethical investing is to me, and that's how I ended up there.
You've spent a good bit of time talking about your values. So for people that are looking for their next thing, how do you, I guess, think about those in terms of priorities? So there's the job, there's the company, what am I doing day in, day out, and who am I working for? But then that values piece, are we aligned? What advice do you give to people that are thinking about what they want to do next and maybe caught up with, like, I want that job title and I want to work for that company? How do you think about the values piece, and what's your advice there?
I think there's real value to just sitting down and saying, like, what's my purpose in life? And that might sound like a pretty full-on question to ask yourself at any age. And honestly, I'm still grappling with it. But ask yourself, what do you really want to achieve in the world, and how you might achieve it. And then whatever job you're going for, think about where that job places in terms of that purpose. So what I mean by that is, like, I don't think I wouldn't have gotten to Mike if I hadn't met Robert. Like, the fact that I had some family office experience, like, did count for something when I went for Mike, despite the fact that, it took me a while to work out what Audant Investments was about. That's Robert White's family office, and figuring out that maybe didn't align in values. But what I'm saying there is that the conventional path may not always be the right path. Like, I could have easily stayed at JP Morgan for another 7 years. I would have gotten to managing director at some point, potentially could have moved overseas and made buy and sell recommendations in the US stock market. But what was the point of that? Like, what am I trying to achieve? And ultimately what I want to do is create a better world, which sounds a little naff, but it's the truth. And Mike has such vision in terms of doing that, and the rest of the team has such vision in terms of doing that. Like, there are not many people in the world who think that they can create a solar farm that's 4 times larger than any other solar farm in the world and export solar energy, to Singapore via a 4,000 kilometer cable. Like, there are very few people who have that big picture. Obviously you can throw in Elon or Jeff or, any of the kind of big CEOs. But it was pretty easy to see that Mike aligned in those values. But I would sit down, like, the advice is sit down and think about what those values are. Like, why do you want what you want? How are you going to achieve it? Are you ready to commit? Ask yourself those questions.
I love how you talk about just the way that you've worked so hard and you've been kind of quite clear of where you want to get to, and you've just gone kind of full on at that. Have you had role models around you? Who has, if anyone, helped you through this journey? Yeah,
I've been fortunate to have a lot of role models. One of my earliest role models at JP Morgan was a woman called Sally Auld. She was the head of economics at JP Morgan, and just an amazing woman, a great orator. She helped me a lot. I used to be very nervous about speaking. I still am pretty nervous about speaking, but you just overcome that. But the great thing about Sally is she was always herself at work. Like, she, like me, we worked in a very, I call them male, pale and stale environment. And Sally is a lesbian, and she was very open about that. And that brought so much comfort to me, because I always felt super different. And the biggest challenge of working in a male dominated environment, I would say, is it's just harder to build rapport. Like, rapport is about reducing differences on a subconscious level. It's really hard to do that when you look different and sound different and, come from a different background to begin with. But she was just great in kind of sticking into her sort of core true values. And she was really celebrated at JP Morgan, which was also very heartening to me. It just showed that you can overcome those differences.
I've got a question from Matt. There's 2 there, so I'm gonna take the other one that's kind of where we're going. With you being quite altruistic and talking about the values piece, do you see this in any way impacting your returns as social impact is potentially limiting?
Yeah, Grok is very definitive on not compromising returns for ESG or impact. And we don't have to. Like, if you think about it, the greatest returns should be delivered by companies that are changing the world for the better. It just makes actual economic sense. Like, if oil companies destroying the world, then they're going to naturally see diminishing returns on investment. Like, there's no separation for us, and we're very much. I do think that impact and ESG has, for some reason, some sort of stigma about producing lower returns. I'm not sure where that has originated from. Maybe because people generally associate philanthropic aims with no returns, but honestly, everything we do, we aim to generate a financial return out of, and not necessarily for Mike. Like, we're very, like, maybe we'll funnel that back into philanthropic means, but we are very concentrated on returns. Like, we have hurdles. I'm remunerated on a absolute return target. Like, that's all part and parcel of what we do.
So many good questions coming through, so I'm going to try and fire through them. You talk about not having a network. What advice do you give to someone in, trying to find a network, particularly if they come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, that you can recommend? Like, where do you start? You
start everywhere, honestly. JP Morgan made it easier. There were like employee networking groups that you could join. So I joined every single one that I could. But just, externally, there are different networks you can join, like Women in Banking and Finance was one that I joined as well. There are like this great thing that happens these days that didn't happen when I was a little younger is like meetups. I'd never heard of a meetup before, but you can like find anything off a meetup. Like, if you're a developer, there are like developer meetups. Soph and I, we go to yoga every Sunday, which is done via a meetup. Like, honestly, just put yourself out there in different ways. Social media has made that a lot easier. Like, even, I don't know, I see, like, I'm part of this group on Facebook called Bondi Local Loop, and people ask for just friends off that, or like different people to hang out with. I think back to what we were discussing before on the value of mentors, like, find someone that you think you align with, and follow them on Twitter, and maybe like try and figure out where they're going and what they're up to, and reach out to them. They might not always have the time, and to be honest, like, I have young women reach out to me all the time, and one of the things I'm trying to figure out is how to upscale my mentoring. It's hard for me to do one-on-one because obviously I'm quite time poor like the rest of us, but I really want to help more young women. So I'm trying to figure out if anyone has any bright ideas on how to upscale mentoring. That would be great.
Have you ever had to balance being great at what you do and getting results with being likable and amiable to get ahead? And I think that's particularly poignant as a woman. Yeah. How do you think about that balance, if you do?
Honestly, I think about it all the time, and it's really hard. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who works for a VC firm, and sometimes it can be hard to be kind of young and bubbly and charismatic and come across as knowing your shit. Like, I don't want to make any bare bones about that. It can be really hard. I think what it comes down to is knowing your shit. Like, just be all over it. They can't argue with you if you are super knowledgeable and have the answers. Like, you are as a woman going to be stigmatized to an extent, and you've just got to know that you can rise above. And once you do, like, there are a lot of perks to being a female in finance or any male-dominated industry. One is, like, you don't get forgotten, so use that. Like, make sure anything you say is particularly memorable. But look, back to the original question, it can be really hard to balance. I just think make sure your stuff ice cold, and that's what'll kind of get you through.
Amazing. Okay, question from Ati. Have you ever experienced imposter syndrome throughout your career? If yes, how have you dealt with it or overcome it?
Yeah, I experience imposter syndrome all the time. I do worry a lot about just perceptions and not knowing enough and all of that. I think it comes down to a couple of things, like just back yourself. I think it was Sheryl Sandberg and Lean In who talked about how women look at a job application and see 10 things that are required, and she can do 8 and not 2, and so she decides not to apply because she thinks she's not gonna be able to do it. A guy sees the same application and can do 2 things and not 8 and thinks he's like the best qualified person for it. Like it's really cliche, but it's true. I've seen this happen like over and over again. And back to your point on the fellowship, so if like just do it, just apply, just back yourself. Like the worst that can happen is you don't get it, and that's then you're back to kind of the same point that you were at before. I think it was Wayne Gretzky who said, you miss 100% of the shots you never take, and that's 100% true. I've applied for anything that I think could get me to where my ultimate kind of goal is, but I haven't gotten everything. Like I've focused a lot on the successes, and I guess the media has focused a lot on successes of myself or Mike or Grok. But to be honest, like I have done plenty of interviews and where I've crashed and burned. Like I once applied for a job at Google, and I was so nervous that I couldn't work out 5% of 20 million on the spot. And for a finance person, that was particularly bad. And I just remember coming out of that and being like, oh, but you learn to like better prep and, go in and calm yourself down before you go in. I think I was just like, oh, it's Google and they have like a monorail in the office and blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
I love that. I didn't know that about you. What do you love most and also find most challenging about your role at Grok?
It's a good question, because what I love most and find most challenging are the same thing, which is the degree of autonomy to which Mike lets me operate. Because we're a small team, and I'm the only person that does the listed equities. Like I have Jeremy and Lucy and Sam definitely give me their opinions, but I'm doing all the background and legwork on it. But I decide, what to focus on, what stocks to look at. And I remember when I first interviewed with Mike, I'd said to him, but what if I lose millions of dollars, like for you? Like I was shit scared of doing that, because up until that point, I had been working in the industry for a decade. So I had a lot of experience and I knew my stuff ice cold. But I had been the junior in the team to that point. I was not the ultimate decision maker. And I went from that to being the ultimate decision maker on, not an immaterial amount of money. And so that was tough, but I just, just backed myself to do it.
So from Jared, what advice would you provide to people with operational backgrounds that want to transition into investment decision-making roles?
Honestly, I actually think that's one of the best positions to be in. I wish I had operational experience. I think it would have taught me a lot about looking at companies from a completely different lens. In terms of the actual advice that I give someone in an operational role, I'd say it's actually really formulaic and easy to learn, like discounted cash flow analysis or how to value a company. There are plenty of free resources out there. Start listening to like podcasts. I don't know if I'm going to give a shout out to my favorite podcast, which is Invest Like the Best. That's always a super interesting one. And actually, there's a recent episode by a guy called Charlie Songhurst, who has gone from being an operator to investment roles. I think he's invested in like 500 different startups. He was like head of strategy at Microsoft. That was one of the best episodes of that podcast that I'd listened to, so highly recommend. but yeah, I'd say you're in a very fortunate position because you've got a completely different lens. And one of the things I worry about with Grok is most of our team is from an investment background and not an operational background. And I wonder if we miss that kind of empathy that you build up from having worked in the business. Jeremy did start 2 startups himself, so he does have some of that, but I certainly don't and wish I had. So I would say, like, you're coming from a winning position, you just need to educate yourself on how to actually value companies, and that's pretty easy given the amount of resources out there.
Awesome. There's quite a lot of questions coming through that are super interesting around like Grok investment process, feedback loop and measure being so long. Where, because we're running out of time, where would you point someone to if there is a place to read up about Grok investment process, and just kind of venturing in this generalization? Yeah.
So because we're a private investment firm, we don't actually put a huge amount of stuff out there just because we're trying to protect the integrity of the family we work for, and the privacy of the family we work for. In terms of process, what I can say is the best way to describe our process is I've surrounded myself, and again, it comes back to that networking, with what I call my inner circle. So it's a bunch of investors who I respect the process of and who I like. And we all sort of share ideas, and that's where I generate a lot of ideas from. I think as investors, you also have to ask yourself where you have insight and advantage. And obviously we've got an amazing resource in Mike, who can honestly pick apart a SaaS company just from looking at their metrics and what they do pretty quickly and say whether it's a good investment or not. So he's kind of my first port of call. Like, I'll look at a company and then say, hey, Mike, have you heard of this company? Do you know the founder? He's like, yes, I like the founder or not. And then I'll be like, well, their net revenue retention is 140%. They are growing at 50%. They were doing operating margins of X%. Like, he's like, yeah, that sounds about right. And we kind of go from there. So that's probably the starting point of our process. I know that was a bit of a wishy-washy answer. I am working on like putting out a blog piece on how I just look at investments. So when that happens, I will definitely let you guys know. I'm sure there's a mailing list for StartMate, and so Soph will send that around.
Awesome. I'm going to send some of these other questions to you because they're just also amazing. Quick one before we go. Why are you called ARMS?
So when I started at JP Morgan, my boss wanted to give me a nickname, and I had told him that up until that point I'd been called Mina. Like at school I was called Mina, at university I was called Mina. That makes sense. My name is Armina. But he was like, oh, it's kind of too girly. It doesn't really roll off the tongue. Like, it's still 2 syllables. He was like, let's call you Arms. And his name at the time was Paul Brunker, and everyone called him Brunks. So I think he actually also liked the fact that we'd be referred to as the Brunks and Arms. Like, it sounds like an old English pub. So it's kind of the combination of those things.
Awesome. Cool. Right on time. So ARMS, thank you so much. Just love this and the energy, and I hope everyone's got some good little snippets from this. Fellowship applications are open. Again, just do it. You've got 2 weeks. Liminal's on every morning, 8 till 9. Right now we've got a breakout session led by Jax from Airtree. So I'll put the link in there if you want to come join. It's a chance to meet other people as well. So thanks so much, ARMS. Yeah, have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Soph. Thanks, everybody.